everyone, and welcome back to Mach 1 Mindset. Today we're diving into AP European History 1.2, the Italian Renaissance. Now before we get started, please make sure you like, subscribe, and of course comment if you have any questions. Let's get started. Today we will examine the Italian Renaissance and why it began in Italy, how humanism reshaped European thought, and how politics, art, and religion changed as a result. The Italian Renaissance was a period of cultural, artistic, and intellectual revival that began in Italy during the 14th century and lasted into the 17th century. It marked the transition from the medieval world to the early modern era. Unlike the Middle Ages, which emphasized tradition and religious authority, the Renaissance focused on human potential, classical learning, and innovation. The Renaissance began in Italy for several important reasons. First, Italy's geographic location made it a center of Mediterranean trade. Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Florence traded extensively with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world. Through these interactions, the ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved and translated by Muslim scholars re-entered Western Europe. This access to classical knowledge directly fueled Renaissance scholarship. Second, Italy was home to wealthy and independent city-states. Unlike much of Europe, which was dominated by the feudal monarchies, Italy was politically fragmented. Powerful city-states such as Florence, Milan, Venice, and Naples, and the Papal States controlled their own governments, economies, and armies. Wealth accumulated through trade, banking, and manufacturing rather than land ownership. This wealth allowed elites to invest in education, art, and architecture. One of the most important features of the Italian Renaissance was patronage. Wealthy families and institutions financially supported artists, writers, and scholars. The Medici family of Florence is the most famous example. Through banking and political influence, the Medici funded artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Patronage allowed artists to focus on innovation and skill rather than survival. At the core of the Italian Renaissance was humanism. Humanism was an intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts, especially Greek and Roman literature, history, and philosophy. Humanists believed education should prepare individuals to be active and effective participants in civic life. Humanism differed sharply from the medieval scholasticism. Medieval education focused on theology and the interpretation of a religious text. Humanism, by contrast, emphasized secular subjects and the value of human reason. This did not mean humanists rejected Christianity. Instead, they believed faith and reason could coexist. Humanism had several defining characteristics. It promoted secularism, meaning an increased focus on worldly matters. It encouraged individualism and personal achievement. It provided classical learning by studying thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle. It encouraged critical thinking and inquiry, which challenged traditional medieval assumptions. Several key thinkers shaped humanist ideas. Plutarch, also called the father of humanism, argued that classical texts contained moral wisdom that can improve society. Machiavelli took a more practical approach to humanism. In The Prince, he argued that rulers should focus on power and stability rather than morality. His work reflected a realistic, secular view of politics. Although Erasmus was a Northern Renaissance figure, his critiques of the church corruption were influenced by the Italian humanist thought. Humanism also challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. As scholars studied classical texts and emphasized reason, people became more willing to question traditional religious interpretations. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century accelerated this process. Books became cheaper and more available, allowing ideas to spread rapidly. Individuals could read and interpret the Bible themselves rather than just relying entirely on the clergy. These developments weakened the Church's monopoly on knowledge and helped lay the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. The Italian Renaissance also transformed politics and society. Italian city-states were often governed by oligarchies, where a small group of wealthy elites held the power. Some city-states hired despots or absolute rulers to maintain stability during times of conflict. Because Italy lacked a strong central monarchy, diplomacy became essential. City-states developed permanent embassies and professional diplomats, setting the foundation for modern diplomacy. Currently, the Italian Renaissance marked a clear break from medieval traditions. Artists moved away from symbolic, flat representations towards realism and naturalism. New techniques such as linear perspective created the illusion of depth and proportion. Artists studied anatomy to portray the human body accurately. Religious subjects remained common, but figures were seen as emotional, physical, and human rather than purely spiritual. Leonardo da Vinci exemplified the Renaissance ideal of the Renaissance man, someone skilled in art, science, engineering, and anatomy. Michelangelo's sculptures and paintings emphasized human strength, emotion, and beauty. These works reflected humanist values by celebrating human capability and creativity. Religiously, the Renaissance did not end Christianity. However, it shifted emphasis away from purely church-centered worldview. Faith became more personal and secular life gained importance. This gradual change weakened the church's dominance over intellectual and cultural life. In conclusion, the Italian Renaissance was driven by trade, wealth, and classical learning, and humanism. It reshaped art, politics, education, and religion. Most importantly, it introduced a new way to thinking that placed human potential at the center of European life, setting the foundation for the modern world.